isn't. I mean, some of them are pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, relative to some of the other ones, right?
Okay, everybody, I think we're ready to reconvene here.
I thought it was hilarious this weekend. Cup of coffee? Really?
Take what you want and I'll fill up.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
That looks like an espresso cup. That's so tiny.
Keep you level.
This is Steve.
Is that one of the Yetis?
No, but it's close.
Observation.
They look really well.
Better pen or?
Have you seen these Yeti?
Yeah, God, you have to go home and buy one.
So they had
Took a picture.
Yeah, right. What do you prefer?
Okay.
So we're gonna have time.
Yeah, I'm gonna kick this off, and you guys, it's sort of, you should bring those much closer.
I know, they got yelled at.
Oh, okay, because then they can't see it. All right. Well, it's sort of like, we'll just pretend that we can see it.
All right, we're going to get going again here. We're going to have all the groups report out from the various scenario stations here in a moment, but I did just want to take a few minutes to talk about what we heard back at the May 30th open house, as well as the City Council Committee of the Whole earlier this week. So we shared much of the same material with the community on May 30th. We did get about 100 attendees. Man, I can't talk anymore. We had about 100 attendees. We also displayed much of this information via social media. We did Facebook Live. We had online comments as well. So we had the ability for folks to interact with this information and provide us with some input in many different ways. As I'm sure you can appreciate, there was a lot of information that we were asking the public to absorb and provide some input back on. In terms of the general themes, we heard a lot about ADA accessibility concerns in regard to these transit scenarios. Access to St. Mary's was also was a theme. Folks really wanted to make sure that our transit scenarios had a good accessibility to St. Mary's, whether that be by transit, by bike, by walking, et cetera, a good multimodal access plan for St. Mary's. There was a fair amount of discussion about both the flexibility inherent in any of these transit options as well as the costs that might be incurred. There was a lot of support for a longer city loop route, and I think we heard that quite a bit in our discussions, or at least I did, at our stations as well. And a lot of support for separation of bikes, peds, and cars, particularly from concerns about safety and multiple sort of levels of expertise and ages of folks who might be using those bike and pedestrian facilities, and therefore keeping that separation, really enhancing the ability of folks of many different levels and different ages to be able to use those bike facilities particularly. In terms of the scenarios themselves, I would say we got a broad range of comments that didn't really give us a good indication one way or the other of a predominant sort of sense that these are exactly the scenarios that the public wanted us to look at. So as I said, it was just a lot of information to understand. I think we got a lot of questions from the public about, so what does this mean and what does that mean? A lot of folks were just wanting to try to understand the scenarios. We did get some comments in regards to the remote parking locations, those areas that we had outlined in the orange circles. We probably had about an equal number of folks saying those remote parking areas were either too close to downtown and an equal number saying they're too far away from downtown. So maybe that means we've got it right, or maybe it doesn't, but we sort of had folks on both sides of the fence on that. We also had, in regards to elevated transit, we had a lot of comments in support of the elevated transit options, recognizing that the streets are already starting to get congested, and maybe that would be a good strategy to being able to have transit and reduce the congestion on the streets. But then we also had about an equal number saying, oh, but what about the visual impact? What about the noise? What about other concerns? What about access? What about clarity of the ability to see where to get on and get off the system? So again, sort of mixed results in regards to elevating transit. A lot of concerns about how is this all going to fit on our streets. We had some of that at our discussion of our stations today. But overall, general agreement that transit is needed, that we need to be looking at our transit situation. So that's what we heard from the public, a real sort of broad mixed bag of comments.
Beth, I'm sorry, pardon me for interrupting, but so when we were thinking about how to facilitate this meeting, I had a bright idea that we ought to kind of go through the feedback that we heard from each one of these stations, but I am now wondering, despite my bright idea, whether this group might want to just have some general conversation before we kind of do a review of each of those things. So could I just take I'm seeing some head nodding of general conversation. So if you'll just, thanks for being flexible, Beth, and everybody.
Absolutely.
And then I want to make sure that we have a chance to have some conversation. People look eager to share their thoughts about all of this. So, RT.
Well, I think there's some really good thing here, and I think we've moved a lot in the last few months, but I'm a bit disappointed, frankly, that there was a significant amount of conversation in the last time about it may be impossible to find a single route that solves all of our problems, and in fact, probably the best solution would be to have a family of solutions. And I didn't see that at all here. When I look up at point number 2 there, it may also reflect the point I'm making about a variety of options. So if we, for instance, look at the idea of the intersection of 14 and 52 being our choke point, if we think about using 16th there as solely a way to get to St. Mary's, and we thought, then as you peel the onion back and you take part of the big honking bunch of commuters we have to get in and peel back a part of it, solve St. Mary's through 16th, and then try to use Civic Center Drive for the people in the center of town, and then try to say that anyone we can possibly get who's coming from the south to come up Broadway, to do that by building amenities along South Broadway and such. That, I thought, was where the conversation was going. What I'm looking at are some good options, but they're a one-size-fits-all, and I don't believe one size can't fit all. The second point is I feel that we can use the city loop in a much more innovative way. Kotsky Park and the creek connected to it is an absolutely spectacular amenity. And on a day like today, what a great thing if a couple blocks closer to the clinic got greened up a little bit so that I could leave my job at the clinic and have a really beautiful green walk to that remote parking. I'm not going to do that when it's 20 below, but for a while here I certainly could. So the city loop could do a better job of connecting that, but in doing that and expanding its footprint, you also, I think, do much more for the residents of this town. So the city loop can be a way to bring green into the heart of the community and also to be able to get a section of, not the large amount, but a section of the commuters to do that last mile on foot or on bike. So those are two pieces I'd like to introduce.
Thank you. Other comments? Thank you.
Well, I'll chime in with a few comments as well. One of the things is I appreciate very much the number of variables that we're talking about and the complexity of managing all those moving parts. So I do appreciate that we're trying to narrow this down into a finite number of scenarios that we can evaluate. A couple of observations as I was listening to all of the plans actually. One, I don't think we can forget some of the other aspects of our transportation network that we have today. There's an overlay that you could apply to any one of these that uses our existing bus transportation system, and that might help people better connect to this, what I'm calling our arterial transit system, to some of the outlying areas. Because one of the comments I heard is that we can't just serve downtown, although I realize that's a goal, but we're trying to serve the entire community. So, and then the other observation I had is I like the scenarios that allow us the most flexibility. So while you might talk about, for example, bus rapid transit, because that's a technology that is here today, autonomous vehicles might not quite be there yet, but we should allow for that sort of hybrid model. So I don't think any one of these scenarios is necessarily mutually exclusive of the others, and we need to keep our options open as much as possible.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So one of the things I wanted to add was building on both of the speakers before me was the autonomous vehicles, I think, really represent a huge mental shift about how we're going to do transit. And I like the idea of, green ways to walk back and forth. And I love the options that give us an ability to seasonally adjust where transit is run. So I think those, autonomous vehicles with the flexibility of the BRT systems where you can move them around, especially systems that allow us to evolve the transit system as we see ridership grow, as we see the uptake downtown. There's one other aspect that maybe is important to the things I like. The things I think represent relatively infeasible options for us. Elevation, I think, really is going to introduce some significant challenges to what we're trying to accomplish. It's not just the capital costs, it's the inflexibility of adjusting routes, of adjusting changes as development happens, as adjusting routes for Mayo Clinic as they move their employment centers around downtown. I think that an elevated option is something we should really consider right now, whether or not that's a route that we want to invest consultant time in evaluating versus what are the technologies that are out there that can meet our BRT systems, that can meet some of these autonomous systems. Who can we bring in to partner to solve some of these challenges going forward? I thought that there was good work all the way around. It was mostly, I agree, a comprehensive approach to transit in downtown that allows that flexibility is where we need to go. So appreciated that, but excited to hear other commenters go down that line.
Good. Other comments? Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, I'll echo some of those comments and some of the comments I made at the committee of the whole meeting. I think the bus rapid transit option really gives us the best path going forward. For some of the same reasons that Mr. Campion mentioned, whether if we put down a rail system or an elevated system, we've really constrained ourselves. The BRT or a rubber tire option really is a segue into the future autonomous vehicles. And I think as far as the capital costs and the operational costs long term, I just think a rubber tire BRT type solution that can segue into more of an autonomous solution in the future really is the way to go, and I think that's where we need to focus our effort.
The autonomous vehicles, I guess I didn't realize that they are as close to being a reality as they are. I spoke with, I can't remember the gentleman's name that was at the last station down here, and apparently they're in beta in California and Florida. Now, of course, they don't have snow in Florida and California, but this technology for transporting not individual people, but where they have like 12 people or 6 people, is expanding pretty rapidly. And I think we should bridge the gap with the BRT and work, like Nick says, on the autonomous vehicle, because they can, you can change as your needs change with the season. Or maybe we build a new building and a lot more patients want to go there. If you have a rail, or you have an elevated system, you're constrained by that. You can change these autonomous vehicles, hopefully, with some more programming. So I'd like to suggest that, possibly we go investigate that autonomous vehicle. Maybe a couple of us, should go look at these things, because I don't have much knowledge of them. And if we're going to be making these decisions, I think maybe a couple of us ought to go out there and look at them.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Not yet.
Yeah,
So
she-
I kind of concur that flexibility is key, and we don't really know about all, our community's going to change dynamically. So being able to have flexibility is really important. I think I've said at a couple stations that it's a little hard not having the transit plan overlay, because I'm very concerned that we do a design that also serves the citizenry of this community well. And I liked, I happened to follow RT at a couple of places where he was thinking about the city loop in a little bit different mode, as not as constrained as the diagrams are right now. thinking about how we might do that so visitors, residents, employees all can use it, those different markets. I learned a long time ago that the construction of something is just 10% of your cost. So when we look at the operational costs and flexibility, I think with those have to be operational cost, flexibility, and then which of the routes. So I liked one of the routes better for the streetcar because it seemed to me that it was tying together the various current high volume use places in a different way than, more comprehensive of tying together all 6 of the DMC zones and then connecting in potentially to the urban village across Broadway, or the potential of accessing Graham Festival grounds or some other kinds of things. I think we need to be flexible, and we need to look at operating costs and have a system that can be modified over time as our needs change. One other thing I'd say, I get a little bit worried about, I think the elevated's all very attractive, but we have a lot of visitors who come here once, and they come here stressed, and they come here anxious, and then to try and find their way, the wayfinding will be really critical. And I don't know how you are, but sometimes just the wayfinding up and down and around in our skyways, and there's not a direct route, it becomes something of a discouragement rather than an enhancement for people. So we have to think about what the experience of the user, the first-time user, and then the long-time user would be. How do they find their way around whatever we create?
Thank you. Ken?
From a county perspective, and I tend to lean toward starting with the BRT. I suspect initially it's easier to get FTA money out of that concept right now. They always seem to have money. One of the few agencies at the federal level that seems to have cash. But from a county perspective, I tend to look at that and say, too close. I mean, all of our arterials is where we're bringing, from our perspective, our system, we're looking at mostly employees. The inbound commute, which we know is very high and going to continue. So I'm more looking at, a little further out in a BRT system to pull those people in to avoid all of the parking problems downtown. So that's, I understand it's the medical district and we're focused that, but from the county's perspective, that's kind of my 2 cents worth is I'm looking at, a little bit further out on my arterials that are going to bring all these people in.
If I could just jump in again, that reminds me that while it isn't really the topic for today, at one of the very first DMC meetings, there was one of the consultants talked about the potential for us to look at economic impacted development for other communities. So as we design the transit systems and the commuter systems, I think we need to be asking ourselves, how do our neighboring cities benefit from this? How do they get the benefit of the kind of growth that we're having? I remember the consultant talking about building a transit center in a smaller community where you would have a convenience store and a daycare center there so that you're strengthening that community's fabric as well as this community's fabric. So I would just urge the DMC folks, while it's not before us today, Pine Island has some proposals of what they'd like to do. I'm sure St. Charles and Stewartville and Austin and Casson and every one of the communities around us. How are we thinking about how do they fit with this system and how do they benefit, as well as and I would add, and how do the residents of this community, the long-term residents, benefit?
Thank you.
I could concur with that point. I have a couple concerns about the automated vehicles. One, I don't see how it handles our rush hour traffic when we have a great majority of the people coming in at one time and leaving at one time. I mean, you would have just stack after stack of these automated vehicles where you can't move a lot of people quickly as you could with the bus rapid transit. And then I'm also concerned is as they're coming down, our streets are going to just be choked off with these automated vehicles. Right now, they're choked off with vehicles, and now they'll be choked off with different-looking vehicles. It doesn't really solve the problem. I mean, it looks cool, and it's fun technology, but I don't think it really solves the problem of moving people from point A to point B like bus rapid transit does.
RT? Thank you.
Just a quick point on Commissioner Cascaden's point, which I think is such a good one, is, this group's charge is not the rest of the area, but we should care a lot about that, and especially for these who are on the county board. Just here's a pet idea of mine that I wanted to pass out to someone. If all those commuter buses that leave here all went to a main street, if Mayo committed that instead of having, because I know where some of those bus stops are all up on the outskirts and parking rides and all that, if every one of those stopped on a main street, and that was tied with some incentive from the county to help do a small amenity there, that's one single stroke that could have a huge impact. There's more, but anyway. One of the things we've got to do is we've got to start taking things off the table without taking things up that we're not going to leave later. Could I try one? This might be a fairly broad stroke, but you can fall in love with a type of transit. Like, I'm a person who really likes a lot rail that will, because you're telling people it's going to be there, they can make investments. So I'm a person who gravitates that. Some are like autonomous vehicles, some are not, but you can't really fall in love with the mode. Transit is like golf. You have a club and you're not in love with your driver or your putter, you just use them in the right spot. So I've been a person from the beginning saying, okay, we need a game-changing transit strategy, and in my head I veered more toward a tram-like situation. But the thing you've got to really also realize is that those are expensive things, and you only use them if you can have one single route to do it, because if you got two routes, it doesn't make sense. I believe that we are at the point where we should say we're going to have a non-rail solution here. And that's a huge pivot for me from the beginning. But the reason I get to that is because I have seen all of your really good work, and I don't see any one of these one routes that solves the problem. And therefore, you can't build two expensive, elevated or rail or whatever, so we've got to have a flexible system. Now, the problem with that is that those of us who believe that rail helps lead development, we got to make sure we're doing other amenities in that. So then the only place I think there should be an exception is we know that second, the Mayo Clinic and St. Mary's ain't moving, right? And I do think we should give the transit planners the look at that. Would be one place where there should, leave those options on the table. But I don't think we should build a rail down Civic Center Drive because we can't come up with the right route to serve them all. I'd instead like to have that kind of resource be used to deconstruct this problem into these micro markets. So I actually, as probably the biggest fixed rail advocate on the group here, think we should pull that off the table. I don't think we should spend a lot of time studying it. And frankly, I don't think we should spend a lot more time studying one route. One route is not going to solve this problem. And none of the options we're looking at, really good transit work, everybody. You did really good work. None of these are good enough. And because we can't think of this as one single place. So that's what I'd like to just sort of put a marker down, and this was a fun little thing to discuss.
If we're going multiple routes, then does that also kind of take the concept of something elevated where you're getting a concentration of investment into a single route out as well?
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
I would argue that we should continue to be open to a fixed strategy on second, period. There's all sorts of other issues. And if somehow somebody came back with something that made sense, elevated or submerged on second, I think we should look at it. There's a cost thing and everything else, but that's the only place where I think it makes sense in this scenario. That's just me talking.
Okay.
Other comments, colleagues? Well, that's good. Beth,
We should hear from them.
Yeah, I think I'd be very interested, given, I think that's excellent feedback, and though I haven't chimed in so much myself, let me just add my 2 cents worth here, which is that I also feel I feel the drive to come up with a solution that is going to give us flexibility, both in terms of routes and also in terms of modes, because it feels like the technology is changing, and we ought to be ready for that change and ready to grab a hold of it as opposed to, not. And I also really like the comments that several folks have made about remembering to think big about the city loop, because I think that that's going to be such an attraction, such an amenity for not only the people who live here, but the people that we want to be living here in 10 years and 15 years. And I'm just quite interested in, I think it's important that we keep the autonomous, my personal opinion is that we keep autonomous vehicles on the, in the scenarios that we're looking at, because it feels like that's the direction that the whole world is going to be moving in terms of transit mode. But with that, I know we have a few more minutes, and I think maybe it would be great to hear from our, hear from Beth and Richard and our other consultants about where you want to go from here.
So thank you, Chair. I guess I'm thinking about that myself a little bit. We've taken some flexibility with the agenda. I do think I would like to get a sense from the group. I guess Mayor Ryback put a concept on the table about maybe taking some of the fixed route analysis off the table. That was also supported by Commissioner Campion, and just thinking about is that is that a broadly shared sentiment? And if so, we may, as we go forward with our work over the next couple of months, think about adjusting our level of efforts if that's something that's broadly shared. So maybe I'll just ask that question.
Archie wants to make a friendly amendment to his comment.
Super quickly, I think that's the second most important part of what I said. The most important in my mind is there's not a one-size solution. So where we left the last meeting is where I'd like to come back to the next one, is what are some ways to deconstruct this with, for instance, using 16th to serve St. Mary's and Civic Center to serve blah, blah, blah.
So just to respond to that comment, that's absolutely something that we intend to be doing and will be doing through the scenario work. So apologies if it felt like we were ignoring that comment. We are still certainly keeping that in mind as we start to mix and match and look at sort of the effectiveness of these connections via various modes. I would also acknowledge from a City Loop perspective as well, and I'm noting that Joni, who's leading our City Loop team efforts, had to leave. But we are very much looking at City Loop as being a key transformative element. As we've gone through looking at potential options for that, it's probably, we have discovered that it is not as tightly tied to some of the transit routing or parking as we potentially may have thought initially. That there's a lot of flexibility in that routing, and we are certainly tending towards looking at the broadest routing of that loop to serve not only the transportation and connectivity functions, but also as an amenity to encourage economic development and serve Rochester neighborhoods as well. I would say in terms, the reason why I focused on the fixed rail, the guideway aspect of it is that would inform a large amount of the work that we're undertaking in the next couple of months. And so just getting a sense of the group's direction or thinking on that prospect would really change how we were maybe approaching our work in the coming time.
Lisa?
I just had one comment, and maybe it's I don't know if it's an amendment or a clarification on your point, RT. From what I'm hearing is fixed rail could be off the table for much of it, but maybe there's a place that it would work, like 2nd Street. Like you said, there's one place that maybe it would work. So I would hate to say we're going to take it totally off the table if, as we do this, if we do this analysis and deconstruct it, if you will, there may be one component, whether you're a fixed rail person or not, there may be one component where that makes a lot of sense once we start to deconstruct this again. So I would hate to take it totally off the table, but perhaps it's not going to work for the majority of our transit options.
Yeah, go ahead.
The study of this that's going to come back, is there a possibility of separating that corridor, and does that make your work more efficient, I guess would be the second part here, because I agree with the multiple paths to that kind of Second Street corridor. But if we are able to eliminate it beyond that, a rail option outside of the Second Street corridor, does that expedite the process you're going to go through?
I would say understanding that we want to look at that Second Street element. So in this particular scenario, the DMC scenario, here we go. Focusing on Second Street as a discrete element and knowing that we want to potentially do that would certainly have us structure our work in a different way. Now I'm looking at I'm looking toward our transit study coordinator. I'll let Mona share some thoughts.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's going to expedite our process. I think you could treat it as a standalone, separate alternative if that's something that the group is interested in looking at. But there still needs to be a fair amount of work to go in and develop concepts, better understand the costs, better understand what the potential demand is for that type of an investment.
So turning around the statement sometimes helps me make it more clear. Would eliminating fixed rail outside of the Second Street corridor expedite or help focus the work you're going to be doing?
We would still be looking at it within a corridor, and we have a limited amount of time, so not necessarily.
Yeah, well, let me just say, and just as a reminder to everybody, our goal here is to give some direction to the staff on our responses to these scenarios. It's not to sort of, we're not officially convened here to make final decisions on any of this. So I think we're giving you, I'm seeing kind of head nodding on this issue of fixed rail, but we're not in a position to totally take things off the table at this point, I don't think. Yeah, Mayor Ryback, and then Jim.
As the one who did the blunt force instrument here to maybe make a point, from Lisa's point, maybe we shouldn't, I don't mean to speak in complete absolutes. So for instance, if this is not saving you a bunch of time, if you come in with the idea that, I don't know, from a north-south, that there's some Civic Center drive to other quick 4-block crossing, something like that. It doesn't have to be just in Second. The point I was trying to make is one big, sweeping, expensive, fixed rail strategy down Civic Center Drive, serving everything is not going to work. I don't think it's a good idea to have somebody going to St. Mary's, hop on a rail, go downtown, and then go underground in a tram back to St. Mary's. I think that's the sort of value I'm trying to get at. So if you come up with something that makes sense north-south as well as Second, I think you should bring it to us. I don't think we want to completely take it off the table, but do you get the macro point we're at, and does that address what you're saying, Lisa?
Yes, yeah.
Jim.
Yeah, I'd concur with that. I think, I agree with that in theory what you're saying. So if that helps you and that saves some time, that's good. If it doesn't, then.
Yeah. Richard?
I asked Beth to go back to this slide because what the feedback I'm getting, and we talked about this at our last meeting, is we talked about we use the word decouple these three markets from each other.
Yeah.
We try to do that a little bit in the scenarios to show a little bit of mix, but the feedback I'm hearing right now is that we need to look at what's the best solution for each of these markets, come at it maybe from that approach versus one size fits all. And that's very helpful for feedback, and we really appreciate that because we've been dwelling on this for a while and wondering how do we bring that to you. And I think today was a good way to evolve to that, so we appreciate the feedback.
Great. Mayor Ryback.
Sorry, two quick things. Number one is it would be really nice to have a fourth thing about residents, which is about people who aren't doing the clinic as part of this. And one other thing, when we went to these 10 things, There's one thing that's not on here, there's kind of an 11, which is build a vibrant city, which, the reason I put that out there is that one of the things that just troubles me is when you get people parking a long ways away, you're less likely to have them staying for dinner, for a theater, or something else like that. So I just want us to keep that in front of it, because at 5 o'clock, when a huge amount of the vitality of this city hops on a bus and leaves, you wind up feeling a little bit of air sucked out of downtown Rochester. And so I think we want to figure that out. And I've said before, if this was another thing, like in downtown Minneapolis, I'm always trying to get, increase the number of people coming on transit, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the problems with that is that if they're getting out of Dodge at 5, they're not going to the restaurant and supporting that. So the parking, it's a larger dynamic. I get into a bunch of it, but I do think number 11 is build a vibrant downtown. Could help us keep that in front of us.
Thank you. Seeing no other further comments from our colleagues here, does anybody have any closing comments or anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion? I think this has been extremely helpful for me and I hope for all of us to really have a chance to take a deeper look at these options. I hope that you feel our intrepid team of experts that you've gotten some feedback that is going to be helpful to you as you move us to the next phase. And these decisions will come back to our various boards, of course, several more times before we have landed on a final option. And so I just really want to thank everybody so much, and it's wonderful to see our colleagues from the county board as well as the city. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, it's fine.
Great.
Thank you for being flexible, you guys.
Yeah, thank you very
We
much.
about 6 curveballs.
Great. Put these together, Lisa.